Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host and producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Today our guest is Constance Ewing Cook, and we're going to be talking about her book, Lobbying for Higher Education, How Colleges and Universities Influence Federal Policy. Well, welcome to Rip Rap, Connie.
Thank you.
Today, I wanted to talk about this book because, first of all, it's come very highly recommended. I noticed that Sheldon Hackney is saying it's a must-read, and a great number of other people have been saying the same thing. This is really an important book. Connie, as I read your interesting study of higher education, the way it's organized itself to influence federal policy, I felt that your unique combination of insights from your training as a political sciences and your experience as a university administrator gives this book a focus and a depth and disciplined study that other books on this topic, that is influencing federal policy, don't have. Could you review with us what you did and how you went about preparing as you sat down to write this book?
Yes, Jim, you're right. I'm a political scientist and my expertise concerns political interest groups. That's been my research area throughout my academic career. And I had some years in Washington working for the U.S. Department of Education, and then at the University of Michigan, initially working as executive assistant to the president. So I've had an opportunity to see higher education lobbying both from the Washington perspective and also from the campus perspective. Before writing the book, I realized that there was not any recent study of how colleges and universities influence federal policy. The last one that was done was about 20 years ago, and it was time to update that information. The interest group literature is full of studies of other policy communities, the energy policy community, healthcare, labor, transportation, agriculture, but not higher education. And given the importance of higher education to our nation, I felt that it was very important for us to understand more clearly how colleges and universities interact with each other and bring their case to public policymakers in Washington.
You had the survey of 2,500 people who were, college, university presidents and administrators and staff and the elected officials in Congress and then people from the executive branch. I thought that was really an interesting aspect, that you really had extensive use of research of the people who are involved with higher education.
I started by doing the survey of college presidents, as you indicated, and I was delighted to find that 2/3 of them returned the 4-page survey I sent them because they too are interested in getting some understanding of how higher ed fares in Washington. Then I did interviews, 150 interviews, with public officials, federal officials, on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch, as well as the association leaders in Washington and college presidents who serve on their boards. Additionally, I interviewed quite a number of lobbyists in Washington to understand how the campus lobbies the Washington community.
Well, no wonder people are saying that this is a must-read book, because this is really a fresh study of a wide range of people here. There's other things that you said in the beginning of the book about the interest of political science in terms of studying public domains and interest groups and how they interact and that sort of thing. And I thought that was also another layer of interest. Did this study evoke some of those interests as you were doing it?
Absolutely. I think that this study is helpful in getting a broader understanding of how interest groups operate. Not just higher education interest groups, but all interest groups. There was interesting data from the surveys and interviews about the perceptions of interest group members and the reasons why they join groups, the reasons why they participate, and the reasons why they retain their memberships in interest groups and associations like the higher education associations. There was also interesting information about lobbying choices and how interest groups go about making decisions about lobbying techniques. So I do feel that the study's findings go beyond the higher education community and help to illuminate interest group politics more broadly.
One of the interesting things that I found in this book, and maybe that wasn't something you exactly intended, but it certainly opened my eyes, was this way that you brought together some specific information about this industry we call higher education. And you had some statistics that gave a much wider overview than what we normally have. Usually people think of higher education in terms of one institution where they send, or another where they send their children for study, or that they may be working at themselves. But do you remember those statistics, the $100 billion
Yes.
industry and the, what was it, 3.1% of the gross national product?
And there are nearly 2 million people working in higher education, either as faculty or as administrators and staff. And additionally, we're dealing with nearly 15 million students at American colleges and universities. So lots of people are affected directly. And of course, there are all the parents of the students, the alumni, the donors, the taxpayers who help to fund higher education. Most people have some concern about higher education that is direct concern because of their own involvement.
I thought it was just a magnificent way of kind of bringing together these parts so that people understand that this really is a national situation that you're talking about. It's not just something that's localized, but there is quite a dimension to it. And then also with that is the idea that higher education is, even though it's taken on this idea of becoming involved with lobbying, it's certainly not one of the major players in terms of money. I think I saw something in the book about, no, there's a newspaper article that the major players these days are like the American Medical Association that spends like $34 million a year. Did you get a sense of the amount of money that was being spent by higher education on its activities in the book?
I can't tell you a dollar figure because there isn't one that we can point to. Ordinarily, when there is discussion about the amount of money that a lobby is spending, that includes political action committee money, donations, and higher education is different from most lobbies in that it is not funding federal political action committees. PACs are not part of the higher education arsenal in Washington. I think that makes higher education unusual. It makes it somewhat less sophisticated. The big players in Washington are the ones that are spending millions of dollars on PAC contributions, and higher education certainly is not in their ranks. Public officials said ordinarily, when asked how effective higher education is, that it falls somewhere in the middle. There are business interests that are far more sophisticated and active on the Washington scene than higher education lobbyists. And then there are some citizen groups, grassroots efforts that are less sophisticated.
And they're having to put the emphasis on persuade rather than buy, I think.
Absolutely. And college presidents prefer that the emphasis be on persuasion rather than trying to buy influence. One of the questions in my survey of college presidents concerned the formation of political action committees, and 85% of the presidents said no, absolutely not. We don't want political action committees. We consider them unethical and immoral. There were interesting quotes of that sort, and the college presidents said that they thought higher education was part of the national interest, and if there were political action committees, that would make it appear to be more of a special interest than it is now.
You did have that one wickedly mischievous or humorous story that you started about the three characters weighed in on the curbside. And
Do you want to hear that
yes,
story?
I want to hear
All
that
right.
story.
That is the beginning of the book, and it's a joke that I heard circulating in Washington about three dogs sitting on a street corner across from a restaurant when a meat truck pulls up, and the driver hops out of the truck to go deliver the meat to the restaurant. And one of the dogs says, "I used to be a lawyer, and I'd like to get some of that meat, so we'll negotiate with the driver and see if he'll give us some meat." The second dog said, "I used to be an architect, and I can figure out the secret passageway into the kitchen of this restaurant so that we can go and get some meat ourselves." The third dog said, "I used to be a college president, and I suggest we just sit here on the corner and whine and beg. That's the way we'll get some
I
meat."
love that story, even though I think that many college presidents might not be as fond of it as I am. I think it was pretty funny. But you do bring up this thing about needing to persuade, and part of that was this organization of the effort to persuade.
Yes.
And I thought maybe we could go through sort of an overview of how that's organized now in Washington, particularly after the advent of the 104th Congress and some of those initiatives. And you had, the American Council on Education, and then the five other, there's some elaborate
Yes.
charts. Maybe you can explain that, how higher education has kind of set itself up to bring the point across.
All right, that's a good question. Higher education is well organized in Washington. There is a real division of labor there. It is true that the American Council on Education is the umbrella association, and it is the one that other associations join so that they meet within its jurisdiction. There are five other presidential higher education associations. Presidential in the sense that the presidents of colleges and universities are the institutional representatives. And additionally, there are about 200 other higher education associations in Washington that are more specialized in nature. They don't all lobby. They aren't all involved in federal relations, but they're located in Washington and have some involvement with higher education. Some of them are specialized types of institutions, like the historically black colleges and universities have their own associations, and religious institutions, Catholic institutions, for example, have their own association. Additionally, there are associations made up of people who are in the same profession. For example, the University of Michigan Regents are part of the Association of Governing Boards that brings together the regents and trustees from institutions all across the country. And political scientists like myself are members of the American Political Science Association. And there are disciplinary associations of that nature for every field. There are also associations that deal with specific issues like graduate studies or medical issues, the American Association of Medical Colleges. And in addition, there are associations that are geographically oriented. Midwestern associations, Big Ten associations, New England associations, New York State. So higher ed has set itself up in such a way that there are many overlapping jurisdictions of associations, but the big six are the ones that try to coordinate the activity of all the others.
Well, that brings up two questions. One is, I remember the issue of umbrella groups in higher, in this interest or influencing process was something that was also of interest to you as a political science.
Yes.
And it seems to be, like a focusing function to take all these resources and to apply them to a certain position or development or dynamic. Is that?
That's right. The umbrella association, in this case the American Council on Education, has as its charter consensus building, bringing all the various players together. There are so many different types of institutions: community colleges, research universities, land grant institutions, private and public, the comprehensive institutions, liberal arts colleges. And the Umbrella Association brings them all together, puts them all at the same table, and tries to get people to reach a consensus about public policy perspectives, so that when higher education goes to Capitol Hill and begins to lobby and bring its position to policymakers, there is one voice rather than multiple voices. ACE is not always able to achieve that consensus, but at least it tries.
I imagine that it serves as kind of a prioritizing function.
That's true,
It
yes.
sounds fascinating, too, that in Washington, the issues, I mean, the procedural issues are so complicated.
Yes.
Something may be before a committee, but there's no chance whatsoever in making it to the floor or for further consideration. And you have to know exactly where to apply the pressure and the person or the staff person or something like that as it's making its way through this labyrinthine process.
Well, the Umbrella Association, as a result,
Right.
is an information sharing mechanism, so that the association heads can go around the table and tell each other what they know about upcoming legislation, key players, important timing issues, and so on.
And we're not talking abstract issues. I mean, these
No.
are very real issues about
That's true.
student aid and research funding
Yes,
and then the different agencies for research funding, which are really important to large universities.
very
and,
definitely.
You know, so that it's not an abstract kind of distant kind of thing. These are all, I mean, you know, some people, there's been times when the financial aid process has to be held up because Congress didn't quite get all of its paperwork done in
That's
time for people to be able to get an
That's
idea
true.
of what their student is going to have available in the fall. There was one other concept that it's the hired gun. I mean, it just sort of, what is a hired gun in this process?
It's a term that I use to apply to for-profit law firms, consulting firms, and lobbying firms in Washington. And I must say, hired gun is not a term that people working in those offices like having applied to them. But it is a colorful term and one that's in wide usage in Washington. Higher education, like all policy communities, calls upon those people from time to time for specialized concerns, such as getting help with acquiring an FCC license for a radio or television station, or getting specific information about grant availability. And so higher ed, like all policy communities, does from time to time hire these experts who give them information and sometimes help with the lobbying process. But higher education does less of that than other industries and policy communities, because higher education has the luxury of having presidents of institutions who are welcome on Capitol Hill. It's unusual for a senator or a member of Congress to refuse to talk with a college president. Usually those people are well respected and they represent important economic engines within the local community. So members of Congress are perfectly willing to provide access to higher education's representatives, especially the presidents. And as a result, higher education hires the hired guns less often than other policy communities do.
Well, it's understandable because, like I said before, some of the political functions, I mean, the legislative are so specialized that, and the administrative issues are sometimes so specialized that you have to have someone who has knowledge of that particular part of the action in order to get it done. But I thought that was quite an interesting term. I mean, in the midst of this formal study that, you know, you came up with this idea of the hired gun, and I kind of liked it. It was kind of fun.
I should mention as well, Jim, that there are campus representatives who have Washington offices. The University of Michigan, for example, is one of about a dozen universities that has its own Washington office. And there are a number of other institutions that have people fly in to Washington either on a regular or irregular basis to lobby and gain information for their individual institutions. So the associations and the hired guns are not the only higher ed representatives. There are also the campus representatives who are in addition to the college presidents.
That's a good point, and that's very important for those institutions too, because you get sort of a first-hand look and report back. And there was
Yes.
a Friday group and those kind of
Yes.
meetings, right?
Yes,
So
lots of meetings
yeah,
among higher
people who are
education
there could meet, but
representatives.
they have certain days they could meet. As you were talking about this point about the national lobbying, then it also occurred to me that there's also issues, particularly for state, in
Yes.
lobbying at the state level, and that perhaps the survey uncovered that, or in your conversations with people and your experience with that. How much did you run into that, and what insights did you find about lobbying at the state level?
Much public policy has moved from the federal level to the state level, especially with the Republican Congress. And so state lobbying is very important. Actually, it's always been important, since it is state funding that provides the appropriations for public institutions. And it's federal funding that provides student aid primarily, and the federal research money, campus-based research. I found that the institutions that are busy at the state level, such as community colleges and some of the state comprehensive institutions especially, that rely heavily on state appropriations, are ones that are not so busy in Washington. And consequently, they rely more on the associations rather than sending their own representatives or going to Washington often themselves.
I noticed also in your book that one of the triggers, and you quite correctly identified this, for this more intense interest in lobbying is the 104th Congress of that
Yes.
contract for America with Newt Gingrich. And before doing the program, actually, we were talking about this. But actually, you point out in the book that because of this increased lobbying, the higher education didn't come out all that badly. They got pretty much what they wanted. But it was in the aftermath of, you know, having to keep this intense interest up that I think you were talking of, speaking of some concern about that part of it, that you, 105th and the 106th Congress, you still have to watch and observe and track what's going on.
Definitely. That's always the case in Washington. You can wake up one morning and find that policymakers have created legislation that will have effects on your community that are not expected or even intended in many cases by the public officials. So it's important to keep track of the legislation underway and make sure that the public officials are fully informed about the implications of the work they're doing. It is true that the 104th Congress made a big difference in higher education lobbying. It came in 1995, as you know, when there was a Republican Senate and House elected for the first time in 40 years. And the Gingrich contract with America had some fine print that said, we're going to cut higher education funding and restructure higher education policies. That was a wake-up call for the higher education community. And they decided that it was time to start lobbying in a more spirited fashion than had been the case before. Traditional higher education lobbying had been very low-key and consisted of the kinds of techniques that absolutely every policy community uses. letters to members of Congress and visits to your congressional delegation and so forth. But after the Gingrich election and the Republican majority, after the November 1994 election, it became apparent that higher education had to do more to be heard on Capitol Hill. So they mobilized and did focus groups and surveys to find out how much public support there was for student financial aid. And when they found that there was tremendous public support, they then began commercials on television and some radio spots. They created an 800 number so that people could call their member of Congress and try to get the message across. They brought in student lobbyists for protests and demonstrations. Students felt very strongly about having their financial aid either eliminated or cut back substantially. And the college presidents also came to Capitol Hill more often than ever had been the case in the past. As a result, higher education was more visible on Capitol Hill, and given the support of the Clinton administration for higher education funding, there was tremendous emphasis on that issue as the 1996 election came on the scene. Clinton was out there using that as an election issue, and it became increasingly awkward for the Republicans to be fighting financial aid or research funding in Congress. So things changed dramatically, and the members of both political parties finally came around and brought the student financial aid levels up to where they'd been in the past, and the research funding as well.